Everyone knows the story of the Titanic, but not many people know that Titanic had two sister ships, and that on the night of its sinking, one of them was rushing to help but didn't make it in time. Bad luck seemed to follow the trio of ships, but each one of them had glorious moments that live in the minds of those who sailed in them. Keep on watching to discover a story of awe, ingenuity, and ill fate. And don't forget to click the subscribe button and turn notifications on to join us on the bright side of life. You know how the iceberg hit the Titanic, how the band played to the end, and how the whole tragedy unfolded, but before it happened, it would have seemed an impossibility for such a ship to meet the end it did. None of that could have been foreseen by White Star Line, the company who built the Titanic, who had high hopes for what the unsinkable ship and its sister ships, the Britannic and the Olympic, would accomplish. The Olympic was the first of the trio to make sail on June 11, 1911, heading towards New York. The sheer size of it would wow the crowds. The Olympic's maiden voyage went without incident, and a crowd of 8,000 people in New York got to explore its luxurious accommodations while it was docked there. There were high expectations for the massive ship, but just around 2 months later, the Olympic crashed with the HMS Hawk. The Hawk got the brunt of the damage, as the bow was left flat as a pancake. After the crash, the Olympic made its way slowly back to Belfast, where the Titanic was being constructed. On the dock, people could see the two enormous ships side by side, as parts of the Titanic were used to put the Olympic back in shape. A rare sight to behold. And on April 14, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg, and minutes later, the crew radioed nearby ships for help. That night, the Olympic was returning from New York when it received the distress signal. The ship turned around and rushed at full speed towards the Titanic, but they were so far away that they would have arrived next night. At some point during the early hours of April 15, 1912, the crew of the Olympic decided they wouldn't make it in time and stopped course. The survivors of the Titanic were eventually rescued by the Carpathia. Olympic was set up with lifeboats for all crew and passengers after the Titanic sank. It went from having 20 lifeboats to 64. Changes were also made to the watertight bulkheads, and an extra hull to construct a type of double hull was installed. It was determined that a double hull would have kept the Titanic from sinking. For several years, Olympic was used in the war effort against Germany. Throughout the years, Olympic carried over 200,000 passengers, which included thousands of Americans fleeing from Europe and troops battling during World War I. One of the most significant moments for this ship was when it struck a German submarine and sank it. It was discovered that the submarine was preparing to fire a torpedo on the Olympic before Olympic rammed it. The Olympic ended up sailing the seas for 3 decades, which earned her the nickname of the Old Reliable, despite some previous accidents. It went on to help the survivors on the HMS Audacious when it was sinking, and do what it couldn't for its sister, Titanic. Eventually, bad luck caught up with the Olympic. The ship crashed with the Nantucket Lightship, and the crash signaled the beginning of the end. Beaten up, and after years of service, the Olympic was demolished and scrapped for parts. The Old Reliable saw many years of service and thousands of passengers, but the Britannic's journey was shorter-lived. When the Titanic sank, White Star Line was faced with a problem, since they already had another enormous ship in the works. White Star Line began construction on the HMHS Britannic on November 30th, 1911, around 4 months before the Titanic sank. Although the Britannic was the youngest of the trio of ships, having been constructed last, it was also the biggest. They intended to name it Gigantic, but after the Titanic's disaster, they changed the name to Britannic, since they considered it to be a lucky name. With the Titanic sinking, the White Star Line underwent rigorous investigation, and many changes were made to the Britannic's design. The Britannic looked very similar to the Titanic, and it had what was at the time the largest marine turbine in the world, able to reach faster speeds than the Olympic. With Titanic's fate fresh in their minds, everything possible was done to ensure the safety of this newer ship. The Britannic was eventually launched on February 26, 1914, almost 2 years after Titanic met its end. After the Titanic's disaster, the White Star Line wanted the Britannic to redeem their name. The Britannic was on its way to becoming a successful ship. It transported passengers for over a year and a half when the British government requisitioned it and turned it into a hospital ship during the beginning of World War I. The ship became an even more impressive sight to look at. It was painted all white, with enormous red crosses on its side to indicate it was a hospital ship. One of the ship's surgeons, Dr. J.T.H. Beaumont, thought of it as the most wonderful hospital ship that ever sailed the seas. It could treat as many as 3,309 patients at once. This is how the Britannic became His Majesty's hospital ship, or HMHS Britannic. Though the sight of this magnificent ship must have put a smile on a wounded soldier's face or two, the Britannic didn't operate for long. Just a year after it was turned into a hospital ship, the Britannic was making its way through the Aegean Sea to pick up wounded soldiers, when it was struck by a loud explosion. The passengers didn't know what had happened, but headed to the deck to disembark. It is unclear what hit the Britannic, but the general consensus is that it was struck by a mine left by a German U-boat, though some still believe a torpedo hit it. The captain tried to move the ship to a beach close by, but the ship was sinking fast. In the desperation, against the captain's orders, several crew members launched lifeboats and disembarked. But since the ship was moving and the propellers working, the lifeboats were sucked and destroyed by the propellers. Though so much effort had gone in to ensure the Britannic was safer than the Titanic, whatever explosion occurred left the Britannic in the same dire condition as the Titanic in just 10 minutes. In a cruel twist of fate, it also sank in the ocean. Unlike Titanic's enormous death toll, only 30 people perished in the sinking of the Britannic, and over 1,000 survived. So many people survived because the accident happened in the morning, when the temperature of the water was warmer and the Greek island Kea was close by to offer help. In the end, the Britannic only sailed the seas for over 2.5 years. The bad luck that followed the Titanic and the Britannic and the accidents and demise of the Olympic was remarkable. But what was most impressive is that there was a woman who sailed on all 3 ships and survived. Violet Jessup was a crew member and nurse aboard the ships. She was there when the Olympic collided with the HMS Hawk in 1911 and disembarked safely. 2 years later, she escaped the sinking of the Titanic in lifeboat number 16, and she showed some women it was safe to board the lifeboats. You'd imagine that would be enough to keep her from ever getting on a boat again, but not for her. A few years later, she served as a nurse in the Britannic while it was used as a hospital ship. When the explosion occurred, Violet jumped overboard, was pulled under by the water, and hit her head on the keel but survived. Can you imagine her experience? She must have had nerves of steel. All in all, the trio of ships saw journeys of triumph and tragedy. Ill fate might have followed them, but all the survivors were left with incredible stories to tell. So tell us, Brightsiders, would you have liked to have seen any of these ships in real life? Let us know in the comments section. Don't forget to give this video a like, share it with your friends, and click subscribe to stay on the bright side.
They were on their way to the New World when a rendezvous with an iceberg crushed all of their dreams and hopes. There was panic and tears and heartbreaking goodbyes, like that of Jack and Rose. Or was there? Let's see how well you know the real story of Titanic. The love story of Jack Dawson and Rose DeWitt Bukater was inspired by true events. What do you say? Is it a myth or a fact? The most emotional Titanic love story was actually all made up by the screenwriter and director of the famous movie, James Cameron. Some passengers featured in the movie were real though, and by a mere coincidence, there was a J. Dawson on board. His name was Joseph, not Jack, and he worked as a coal trimmer. The most expensive object lost with the Titanic was a painting by Pablo Picasso. What's your take on this one? It's a myth. Another one given to us by the famous movie. The most valuable item that went down with the Titanic was probably a Mary Joseph Blondell painting, created in 1814. Some other valuable items were a violin that belonged to Wallace Hartley, the musician who insisted that they had to play till the very last moment. There was also a 1912 Renault Type CB Coupe de Ville that would now cost millions of dollars, a handwritten manuscript by Joseph Conrad, first edition essays by Francis Bacon, 5 Steinway grand pianos, and, of course, some fine china plates and cups and first-class passengers' jewelry. The Titanic was the largest and the most luxurious passenger ship of its time. Does it sound real to you? Yep, it's totally true. In April 1912, the Titanic was the largest ship ever built. It was 882 feet long and had a maximum passenger capacity of 2,435 people. That's not a lot compared to the largest cruise ship of today, the Symphony of the Seas. It's just a bit longer than the Titanic, but has more than double the passenger numbers. And yes, no other cruise liner has probably beaten the Titanic in terms of luxury to this day. It costs more than $200 million to build in today's money. The tickets were also quite expensive. Duh! First-class tickets ranged in price from $1,700 in today's money for a berth up to $50,000 for one of the 2 parlor suites. Second-class tickets were $700. Third-class passengers had to pay between $170 to $460. Most of the passengers of the unsinkable ship managed to survive. True or false? Sadly, it's false. Only 37% of all the passengers actually survived the meeting with the Titanic. Around 61% of the first-class passengers, 42% of the second-class passengers, and 24% of the third-class passengers made it out alive. The Titanic was passing through the Bermuda Triangle when things went wrong, and that's probably why it sunk. What do you say? Myth or reality? It's 100% a myth. The Titanic never even came close to the Bermuda Triangle. The liner sank about 400 miles south of Newfoundland, which is a huge distance to the north of Bermuda, the infamous area where ships and planes disappear without a trace. We might have the moon to blame for the sinking of the Titanic. True or false? This one is true. The moon heavily affects the tides on Earth. The closer the moon is to the Earth, the stronger the tides are because of the increasing gravity of our satellite. Back in 1912, the moon was so close it made several glaciers in Greenland break apart. Massive chunks of ice that broke off from the glaciers started floating south. The supermoon event came just 6 minutes after a spring tide, the alignment of the moon, the sun, and the Earth that makes their combined gravity reach its peak twice a month. And the day before, our planet had come the closest to the sun that year, which made the gravity even stronger. This mixture of events created perfect conditions for one of the most powerful tides in history. Icebergs breaking off from Greenland's glaciers drift off to the coastal waters of Labrador and Newfoundland, where they often run aground. To move on, they need to either melt and become lighter or catch a high tide that would carry them further. The 1912's tide was as high as it gets. So they shifted many shipping routes south because of the huge amount of icebergs. But not the Titanic, of course, as they believed it was unsinkable. It took 4 hours and 40 minutes for the Titanic to sink. What do you say? It's false, and if you're a Titanic expert, you definitely know it was actually 2 hours and 40 minutes. And this was slow enough, given the damage caused by the iceberg. It didn't sink faster, thanks to the ship's construction. There were 16 watertight compartments in the lower part of the ship. They worked as a lifeline. When the iceberg crashed into the hull, it broke into 6 boxes. The Titanic could have stayed afloat only if 4 compartments had been damaged. Water filled the first 6 compartments within 1 hour. During this time, the ship tilted slightly to the right side. Then, water began to flood the 7th box when all 6 boxes were filled. And from that moment, the sinking rate was growing with every second. The ship's bow sank under the water, and then the stern filled up. One of the leading reasons for the Titanic tragedy was signal rockets. True or false? What's your take on it? This one is true. When any ship sinks, the crew members must release red flares. It's a signal to all nearby ships that someone is in trouble. But for an unknown reason, someone put white lights in the Titanic's rocket box. When the ship crashed into an iceberg, the crew members released white flares. Another ship, SS Californian, was nearby at the time. Its captain knew the Titanic was going through a dangerous iceberg area. The crew of this ship didn't see the Titanic in the dark, but they noticed white rockets. Radio communication between the vessels didn't work. The SS Californian operator turned off the receiver. The Californian captain felt that something was wrong, so he sent a Morse lamp signal to the Titanic. But it was too late. The ship was already underwater, so no one could respond. Another ship, Samson, was sailing alongside the Titanic. It drifted with lights off since it was catching seals, and that's not legal. When the captain saw the Titanic's white rockets, he thought it was the Coast Guard. So Samson sailed away as fast as they could. They realized they had abandoned the drowning passengers once they made it to Iceland and learned the horrible news. In 1996, one expedition managed to raise the Titanic from the ocean floor. Do you believe it? If you don't, you're right. There were different ideas on how to raise the Titanic, from doing it with compressed air to putting it in wire mesh and covering it with liquid nitrogen, or using giant magnets. The only real attempt to raise the Titanic was made in 1996, and it failed dramatically. The expedition's goal was to lift a part of its hull, weighing about 21 tons. It would still have been the largest piece to see the sunlight again, if the operation had succeeded, that is. They lowered 4 large bags filled with diesel fuel to the bottom of the ocean and attached them to the hull plate. Then, the fuel bags were released and they started lifting the pieces on their own. The plate was about 200 feet below the surface when the weather got rough. The expedition members decided to tow the part to calmer waters around 80 miles away. Long before they reached the towing destination, half of the plate broke off and sank to the bottom again. 2 of the lifting bags seemed to have broken loose and the hull went down. The Titanic will most likely crumble to dust halfway up if someone tries lifting it again. So, how many correct answers do you have? Let me know in the comments below.
Can you guess how many theories of the Titanic's sinking exist? Right, loads, including a theory of my own, which I'm going to share with you today. And then you can decide which one seems most likely to you. One Piece theory. The very first version of the events was the One Piece theory. It's very simple and basically claims that the sinking happened without any breakups. 2:15 a.m., the ship collides with an iceberg. 2:18 a.m., the lights go out. The ship reaches an angle of 45 degrees and then quickly begins its final plunge into the ocean depths. 2:20 a.m., only about 3 minutes later, the RMS Titanic disappears under the surface of the ocean for good. The liner doesn't break, it just goes down as a whole piece. Of course, this can't be true. In April 1912, the Titanic was not only the largest ship in the world, but also the largest ship ever built. It's hard to believe that such a heavy vessel could have gone down without breaking. That's just impossible. Well, I mean, you can't blame the theorists. Before we found the wreckage, there were no other theories. Wait a minute, or were there? The day after the disaster, the survivors gave their interviews. They talked about what had happened, and some of them claimed that the ship had actually broken in two when it had been flooded. For example, Jack Thayer, a 17-year-old boy, outlined the sinking as he remembered it, and L.D. Skidmon drew a sketch based on his description. The picture clearly showed the ship breaking in half. But no one believed Jack or other witnesses. There was no evidence, so their claims were received with a grain of salt. But in 1985, things changed. First, breakup theory. That's when Robert Ballard found the wreckage of the Titanic in the depths of the ocean. When people saw the wreckage, it became clear that Jack and the other survivors had been right. The Titanic did indeed break in two when it sank. So it's time for a new theory. 2:15 a.m. The keel breaks. The starboard list eases, and the hull continues to bow and crumble. 2:17 a.m. The galley sections break off. The towers immediately drop under their own weight. The lights go out. The stern is pulled into the air. The bow breaks off and starts sinking. The aft is barely hanging on to the starboard side of the stern section superstructure. The stern section slowly lists over to port as it begins sinking again. It rises up one last time and pivots in a semicircle as it sinks. It all sounds pretty convincing, right? But people began to find plot holes in this theory. For example, the Titanic couldn't have held together until it reached such a high angle. The breakup would have had to begin much earlier. This only meant there was still a vast field for research and speculations. So people started to come up with their own possible scenarios. How about we look first at the ones no one likes? V-brake and Aaron 1912 V-brake. According to the first breakup theory, the Titanic reached a high angle, and the weight of its unsupported stern caused it to crack from the top down. But it's physically impossible. So, are there any other ideas? In 2006, Roger Long, a naval architect, decided to research a so-called V theory. 2:17 a.m. The breakup begins at a shallow angle, perhaps as little as 11 degrees. The upper structure fails and starts to crack. At this moment, only its double bottom is holding the Titanic together, but it starts to bend under the strain too, failing the ship. Water is pouring through the crack. It increases the weight in between the two sections, bending the Titanic the other way and pulling it into shape somewhat resemblant to the letter V. The upper decks get mangled and bent together. The bow heads for the bottom, and the stern is the last to sink. This theory has since been disproven many times, though. Roger Long believed it because the broken edges of the upper decks in the Titanic's bow section were all mangled and crushed. However, we have learned that it happened because of the so-called hydraulic downburst, the force of the water crashing into the deck as the Titanic hit the ocean floor. Another V-brake theory states that the bow had risen out of the water after the break. This theory was mainly peddled by one former Titanic enthusiast. But not only has this theory been proved to be physically impossible due to the bow's incredible mass, it was also inspired by incorrect information. Remember Jack Thayer? Well, it was based on his sketch and the words of a couple of passengers. But the truth is, none of them had ever seen the Titanic break down like this. Jack himself even stated in an interview that the sketch was completely out of context to what he had actually seen. It was drawn by a passenger on the Carpathia, the ship that received the Titanic's distress signal and came to its aid. It couldn't be used as evidence. Now that we know this, let's move on to the theories that most people believe in. James Cameron's banana peel theory. Who hasn't seen the legendary movie about the Titanic, right? It became the leader of the 70th Academy Awards ceremony in the number of nominations and awards, and deservedly so. But did you know that James Cameron had been interested in the Titanic for many years and studied the ship's history? His books and research are very detailed, and he even came up with his own version of the events. It's called the banana split theory, and this is actually what you could see in the movie. Here's how it goes. The Titanic reaches a 23-degree angle and fractures down to the keel. The double bottom acts as a hinge as the stern falls down. When the double bottom fails, the bow and the stern separate. The stern lists to port, standing vertically, and then begins to go underwater. This theory is the most scientifically accurate one, along with Roy Mengat's theory. Wait, who's Roy Mengat? Mengat theory. Roy Mengat was an engineer who came up with the most plausible theory for the time being. 2:17 a.m. The lights go out on the Titanic. At this moment, the ship is at an angle of 20 to 23 degrees. Suddenly, the vessel snaps in two just around the third funnel. It causes the stern to settle into the water. The keel fails first. the draft and lower hull are crushed and break apart. Water surges into the bow and stern of the ship through the huge cracks, causing the bow section to sink beneath the waves. The stern rises up to the angle of 70 to 90 degrees, and then it sinks too. This theory seems to make the most sense, but it's quite controversial. The survivors who saw the breakup stated that the stern had settled back with the bow completely missing. Mengat's theory, however, contradicts that statement, while James Cameron's scenario takes this into account. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? The truth must be somewhere in the middle. My version. Now, as promised, I'll provide you with my version of the events. Well, it's not really my theory, more like a combination of Roy Mengat's and James Cameron's ones. I believe that James Cameron was right about the breakup. 2:17 a.m. The ship is at a high angle. The lights go out. Then it snaps into two pieces. The bow starts sinking. The double bottom is still attached to the stern for a minute or so. Once the double bottom fails, the two parts separate and the bow goes down. Then, as Mengat said, the stern rises up at a high angle, and then it begins to sink vertically. It might have actually happened because the survivors stated that they had seen a clean break. This means it couldn't be hidden. And they had also seen the stern staying vertically in the air for a long enough time, probably a few minutes, before disappearing. Anyways, all of these are just speculations. Regardless of how the Titanic broke apart and sank, it was a great tragedy. It's already been 110 years since the Titanic collided with an iceberg and sank. Did you know that in 2022, the Blue Star Line Company is completing the construction of an exact replica of the Titanic? Called the Titanic II liner, the ship will be sent sailing along the same route with 2,400 people on board. Let's hope that everything goes well for them. Have you ever wondered how much of the Titanic is left these days? Now, if you haven't been living under a rock, you probably know that it's been over 100 years since the world's most famous ship turned into a wreck. The RMS Titanic, the world's largest sea liner from the beginning of the 1900s, sank during its maiden voyage, just a few days after leaving port. The ship struck an iceberg on April 14, 1912, taking down over 1,500 passengers of more than 2,200 who were on board the liner at that time. As shocking as this may sound, the Titanic took over 3 years to be built and only 3 hours to sink. And if it were today, the ship would have cost over $210 million to be made. It was last seen on the surface of the Atlantic at 2:20 a.m., and for many decades, that was the last time people saw it. It wasn't until 1985 that the whereabouts of the ship were discovered by oceanographer Robert Ballard, and some parts of the Titanic became visible once again. One of the first discoveries made by Ballard's expedition was that the ship was indeed torn in half before sinking. The early exploratory missions to the part of the ocean floor where the Titanic now lies could only see the hull and the deck of the ship. According to Ballard, the main purpose of these missions was to understand how to preserve the ruins from deteriorating. Another goal was to recover the huge number of personal items scattered along the seabed. The explorer later said the view down there was as shocking as it was emotional. In the field of debris around the wreck, the oceanographer discovered plenty of small objects and personal belongings, many of which he brought back to the surface. There were shoes, some fancier than others. There were pieces of clothing that belonged to crew members, and there were huge propellers. If on the surface they gleamed and shined, on the ocean floor they were embedded and devoured by sand. Ballard pointed out that the area where kitchenware was scattered measured more than a mile in length. There were enough plates, pots, and pans to fill up an entire industrial kitchen. For the first time ever, 3D animation footage reveals exciting images. The simulations show the Titanic's evolution from when she first set sail in 1912 until the state of her ruins today. But simulations weren't enough for deep-sea explorer James Cameron, who envisioned traveling to the heart of the wreck for the first time ever in the history of the ship. Yep, the same James Cameron who happens to be the director of a very famous movie about the ship. He has now dived 33 times to visit the wreck of the Titanic. Here's some fun trivia for you. The director says that his true passion has always been the ocean, and that ever since he was a kid, he wanted to study the sea. Directing, let's say, just happened to be his day job. And when the possibility of directing Titanic appeared, he said yes, just so that he could go and check out the ruins of the ship in real life. Now back to the wreck. According to James Cameron, it wasn't enough for researchers to access only the exterior of the ship. They needed to go inside, analyze and photograph what was left of the pompous interiors of the world's once biggest sea liner. Cameron piloted an innovative robot vehicle equipped with cameras. It helped the man to reveal spaces in the Titanic that no one had ever seen before since the ship touched the bottom. Turkish baths, for instance, still had their tiled walls standing up almost in all their entirety. These baths were exclusively for first-class passengers. They were located right next to the swimming bath and the third-class dining room, and were designed in the Moorish style. People resting there could get heating blankets and ask waiters to bring them anything they needed. If the pictures from before the disaster were astonishing, they carry a different kind of wow factor now, when everything you see in them is hidden underneath the surface of the water. Another shocking discovery was the ship's mast. If we look at the Titanic in its pre-sinking glory, the mast calls much of one's attention. Located on the bow of the huge ship, the mast held together the transmission cables for the Marconi system, a system of wireless telegraphy. That's also where the British merchant flag the Titanic flew was located. The mast stood at the height of a bit more than 100 feet and was equipped with a crow's nest. Nowadays, the mast is unrecognizable. Attacked by corrosion, it collapsed. The crow's nest broke apart too. Now we can see why the modern-day Titanic is a real treasure for deep-sea explorers. But as the wreck of the ship lies at an approximate depth of 12,500 feet, sunlight is non-existent there. So, piloted missions depend on high-end technological equipment to survey the area. Why do you think the Titanic went missing from the public eye for over 70 years? Well, because at that time, technology wasn't advanced enough for people to go down there, as well as bring back good footage of the wreck. Filmmakers were the ones who drove this technology to its advance by trying to film underwater. They began by building boxes to put their cameras inside. And now, deep-sea photography is highly advanced and allows us to marvel at the awesomeness of underwater life. Of course, taking pictures under the sea is no easy feat. For one thing, to withstand that crazy underwater pressure, submarines need to be really strong and have thick walls, no thinner than 11 inches. Plus, explorers need to understand how to film and photograph when there's almost no light around. There was another thing that made documenting the Titanic even more difficult. When the wreck of the ship was rediscovered by scientists, it was covered with red-colored rusty bacteria that made it even harder to take good pictures. As it happens, the color red does not reflect well underwater, which is unfortunate for photographers. For this reason, human-operated vehicles that go down to tour the ruins are equipped with powerful lighting devices. When you see some parts of the ship from afar, they look as if reddish-brown wax has been dripping all over the Titanic's ruins. But in reality, these icicle-shaped structures are colonies of microorganisms. When the ship sank, it brought down with it an enormous amount of bacteria that hadn't existed at the bottom of the ocean before. But now, these bacteria, together with the extreme conditions at the bottom of the ocean, have turned into a disastrous combination for the ruins of the ship. These red colonies of microorganisms actually feed off of iron and steel, which is basically all that is left of the Titanic. One kind of those microorganisms are bacteria called Halomonas titanicae. They can eat up to 220 pounds of iron per day. This makes the Titanic a colossal food source for them. There have been lots of speculations regarding the life expectancy of the ship's wreck after researchers discovered this bizarre rust. But according to Cameron and his research team, the Titanic isn't going to disintegrate anytime soon. In one of the latest expeditions down to the wreck, a piloted vehicle was funded to identify specifically one stateroom. It belonged to a very important passenger, Sir Benjamin Guggenheim. Yes, just like the museum. Guggenheim was the son of a mining magnate and a member of the elite group that boarded the transatlantic journey of the Titanic. Born in Philadelphia, Guggenheim was traveling back home to the US. But, as we all know, he never made it to his final destination. for the price that ranged from 400 to 800 pounds back in 1912, the equivalent of 84,000 pounds nowadays, one could book accommodation that was called a stateroom. Staterooms on the Titanic were the most luxurious kind of first-class rooms. They were located on the B or C decks and were decorated in more than 11 different styles, ranging from Jacobean, Georgian, Italian Renaissance, and the list goes on. These rooms were filled with carved paneling and marquetry made from exotic and rare kinds of wood, such as mahogany, oak, and so on. Guggenheim occupied one of these luxurious rooms, and 100 years later, one of his descendants funded an entire mission just to locate the precise stateroom the man stayed in. This expedition turned into a documentary for National Geographic, and they did manage to identify which stateroom was Guggenheim's, so kudos for them.
April 14th, 1912. The Titanic crashed into a huge iceberg and sank. Yep, we've covered that. But what if this time we use the ice to bring the ship to the surface? This requires several thousand feet of wire mesh and a lot of liquid nitrogen. Our goal is to put the Titanic in a huge block of ice that will raise the ship to the surface. Now to do this, you need to wrap the wreck in a wire mesh and cover it with liquid nitrogen. The first problem you face is the inability to wrap the ship completely. You need to somehow lift the ship a little to put the mesh under it. Let's say that by some miracle you manage to do so. Next, you need to transport hundreds of large tanks of liquid nitrogen. You're underwater, opening the tanks, and it's so cold that the icy water of the Atlantic Ocean looks like it's boiling. The nitrogen just sizzles, dissipates, and certainly doesn't create a block of ice around the mesh. Alright, new attempt. Raise the Titanic with the help of huge magnets. For this, you need a large cruiser and some powerful magnets. You attach thick cables to the magnets and lower them to the bottom. Bright projectors illuminate the black ocean depths. Parts of the wreck are visible. The magnets descend lower and cling to the iron hull of the ship. The cruiser pulls the cables and magnets up. Some of them detach from the Titanic as the iron surface is covered with reefs and corals. Some parts of the wreck break away from the ship and rise. The power of the cruiser is not enough. One of the cables is torn. Not only the weight of the individual parts of the Titanic, but also the colossal water pressure interferes with the operation. The sunken ship can't be raised completely, only its small parts. In reality, there has already been an attempt to raise the Titanic in parts. The $5 million operation failed. Nylon slings were attached to a large part of the wreck. The other ends of the slings were connected to the diesel engines. For the entire operation, they used a mini submarine. A piece of the Titanic weighing 21 tons was pulled up, but one of the slings broke because of the strong water pressure. Then, one by one, the other cables began to snap, and a huge piece fell back to the seafloor. By this time, all the participants of the rescue operation had run out of food supplies, and it was far from the nearest shore, so they decided not to make a second attempt. A book was written and a movie was made about how the Titanic was lifted with compressed air. In reality, no one even attempted this operation. To do this, you'd need several hundred large cylinders of compressed air. At first, you install them inside the Titanic's hull and wait for them to pull the ship to the surface. As soon as you lower the cylinders under the water, they immediately float upwards. This greatly complicates the operation. You need to fasten the cylinders with cables and pull them down to the bottom using a powerful submarine, or better yet, several of them. Because of the high pressure, the cylinders might burst. In this case, the blast wave would hit other cylinders and provoke a catastrophe. Too expensive and unsafe. The most expensive and complex plan to raise the Titanic is probably the one where scientists somehow extract hydrogen and oxygen from the ocean water. Then, these extracted elements must fill special containers. Those containers are attached to the ship, and the Titanic would rise to the surface. Even if you extract oxygen and hydrogen from millions of tons of water, the rest of the ocean water will replace it. A machine that will be capable of such filtering should cost billions of dollars. Or you can come up with a chemical element that will use a chain reaction to purify all the water. In this case, the entire world ocean will be left without vital oxygen. Someone once suggested blowing up the Titanic. You'd need to lower several boxes of dynamite to the ocean floor. The boxes must be completely sealed to prevent the dynamite from getting wet. Next, you need to run several miles of wire conducting an electrical current to them. Once all this is done, you sail to a safe distance. Now, you're going to press the button to pass the current through the wire and activate the dynamite. 3, 2, 1, stop! Why would you do this? Even if it works, the wreckage of the Titanic will be scattered in all directions on the seabed. It will be impossible to lift the Titanic from the ocean. Imagine a huge hook that can fetch the Titanic and lift it from the bottom like a fish. This hook must be huge to pick up a sunken ship. Let's say you created it. Next, you're on a huge cruiser, sailing up to the crash site and lowering the hook down like an anchor. It falls right on the Titanic but doesn't cling to it. You need special equipment to attach a bus-sized hook to the Titanic. It would include a huge submarine with mechanical arms. To build such a device and make it work under enormous pressure is already next to impossible. But let's say you finally managed to hook the Titanic. It's then you realize the cruiser doesn't have enough power to lift the ship, weighing more than 50 tons, and the hook that adds about 10 tons more. To complete your task, you'll need a few more cruisers and a few extra $1 million. Once hot wax cools, it hardens and floats on the water surface. What if we deliver it to the ocean floor and pour it inside the Titanic? This may work, given that wax is not an expensive material. So, you melt the wax, pour it into strong tanks, and pull them to the bottom with the help of a submarine. The tanks can withstand enormous pressure, and the submarine has enough power to lower the wax to such a depth. The containers are placed inside the Titanic. Through a remote control, you open the containers, but the wax doesn't pour out. The deeper you go, the colder the water gets. While you were delivering the containers to the ship, the wax was cooling down and getting solid inside. Several containers are pressed against the top of the ship, but it's not enough to lift the Titanic. Other containers simply float away to the surface. And even if the containers were thermostatic and kept hot inside all the time, once released, the wax would solidify in an instant. There would just be no time for it to spread and cover the Titanic from within, so it would just float up as well. Alright, you fill several large and sturdy bags with Vaseline. This substance acts just like wax in the cold. It gets solid and floats. You want to put bags all over the Titanic and just wait for the Vaseline to bring it up. You load the bags into the submarine and descend to the ocean floor. Some parts of the ship can't be reached because of the clinging corals. You decide to unload all the bags in one place, but as soon as you take Vaseline out of the submarine, the bags tear due to the strong pressure. Solid pieces of Vaseline float up, pushed by the water. Mission failed. The craziest idea is to fill the Titanic with millions of ping pong balls. Small plastic balls filled with air should push the ship to the surface. But as soon as you start to lower them to the bottom, the plastic immediately flattens and all the air from the balls pops out. You can deliver the balls inside a submarine, but once you put them inside the Titanic, the pressure will crush them again. Also, you can create balls made from strong ultralight material and fill them with air. In this case, you will need much more money. As soon as you put the balls inside the ship, some of them will immediately slip through the holes in the ship, and the remaining ones won't be enough to lift the wreck weighing more than 50 tons from the bottom. Well, to study the Titanic, you don't need to go down to the ocean floor. On the internet, you can find a detailed 3D map that shows the wreck site, as well as the ship itself on the seabed. To get a realistic picture of the Titanic, researchers used sonar technologies and underwater robots, which took more than 10,000 pictures of the sunken ship. So, what do you think? Leave it alone? Yeah, me too. You know SOS, don't you? 3 dots, 3 dashes, and 3 more dots. It's an easy enough signal to tap out in Morse code. It means save our souls or save our ship. The crew of the legendary Titanic had been desperately trying to send this signal for 2 hours the night of April 14, 1912. There were other ships not too far from the spot where the iceberg took down the mighty Titan of the sea. But the call for help seemingly disappeared before it could reach them. The passenger ship SS Mount Temple did pick up a signal and try to respond, but the Titanic never got the answer. So what was silencing the ship's cries for help? Some unknown Bermuda Triangle of the North Atlantic? Consider this. Eyewitnesses say the sky was painted with a brilliant aurora borealis that cold, fateful night. Beautiful, yes. But on that day, the northern lights may have sealed Titanic's fate for good. You see, the aurora borealis forms thanks to geomagnetic storms. Sounds complicated, but those are basically fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic sphere. And what causes those is the sun itself. The magnetic sphere is like a protective bubble that surrounds our planet. It blocks harmful solar rays, winds, and other cosmic dangers from reaching us. Without it, life on our planet wouldn't be possible. Earth would look more like Mars. You also have it to thank for compasses pointing north. Experts know the Earth's magnetosphere affects navigational equipment, or disrupts it. Which brings us back to the Titanic. Recently, a published weather researcher named Mila Zenkova proposed a theory that solar flares, which provoked a geomagnetic storm, could have played a major role in the Titanic's untimely demise. Solar flares make themselves known on Earth all the time. Some people are especially sensitive to the magnetic storms they cause. These unlucky folks can feel weakness, fatigue, headaches, and even mood swings. On usual days, the pressure is the same on both sides. The magnetosphere blocks all the bad stuff, and we're all happy. But sometimes, explosions occur on the sun. They can be massive, Earth-sized. These flares shoot out a wave of charged particles that collides with the magnetosphere at high speeds. Our protective bubble then goes on the defense. It shrinks, deforms, and pushes those particles toward the poles. Enter those brilliant lights dancing above the Titanic that night. In the north, we know it as Aurora Borealis. In the south, Aurora Australis, or the Southern Lights. When the magnetosphere pushes those solar and cosmic particles toward the poles, they collide with molecules of different gases. That's why you get the range of colors. For example, oxygen can be green or red depending on the distance, and nitrogen is blue or purple. What multiple people saw that night was exactly this phenomenon, including the second officer from the rescue ship Carpathia. He wrote it down in the logbook before getting the distress call from the Titanic. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Auroras are a visible sign of a geomagnetic storm. Now, about navigational equipment. This applies to satellite and radio frequency devices. Remember, they didn't have iPhones back in the Titanic days, so the average person couldn't notice their gadgets going haywire. But navigational devices and wireless telegraph did exist and were actively used. Rewind back to the Middle Ages, when sailors noticed that, on some days, compasses wigged out. The arrows spun in all directions, and people back then had no idea why. It wasn't until the 18th century when French scientists found out that such problematic days occur at the same time as black spots appearing on the sun. Solar flares, the mystery was solved. Now, the Titanic had the most advanced, well-known radio equipment at that time. They tested it thoroughly to make sure it worked for distances up to 2,000 miles away. Titanics passed them all. On April 10, 1912, the massive liner left Southampton and set off for New York. The very next day, the crew started getting the first reports of drifting icebergs and ice fields. They put dots on the map to mark the coordinates and let out a sigh of relief. All the troublesome spots were north of the Titanic's planned route. But after a couple of days, the warnings were moving farther and farther south, encroaching on the majestic ship. On April 14th, Captain Edward Smith decided to change course to the south in hopes of bypassing the ice. This ended up being a huge mistake. Enter the magnetic storm. If it was throwing the navigation equipment off, even by a tiny error of half a degree, the captain could have been mistakenly taking the ship right toward a cluster of icebergs. What's even worse, the radio operators ignored warnings coming from other ships. That, or they simply forgot to hand them over to the captain. As hired contractors from the radio company, they were more interested in transmitting paid telegrams from passengers on that luxurious liner. The radio transmitter kept going out of order that evening, probably because of all this private traffic. When it was finally fixed, operator Jack Phillips received another message from the SS Californian at 10:30 p.m. Their operator was trying to warn Phillips about the coordinates of drifting icebergs, but he paid them no attention. He was nervous and in a hurry. Was the magnetic storm to blame for his frayed nerves and bad mood? We can only speculate. But as you know, some people are more sensitive to these things. The weather was fine, the ocean was calm, the water was smooth as glass. Despite all the warnings, the ship continued to sail at a maximum speed of over 22 knots. An hour later, Titanic collided with the infamous iceberg. On April 15th at 12:14 a.m., in the middle of the night, Titanic's operator started to transmit the first emergency signals. The SS Californian was sailing just 20 miles from the Titanic. They could have easily come to a quick rescue. But 10 minutes before the disaster, the Californian's radio operator had gone to bed. He was the only one who understood Morse code on the ship. According to this new theory, the magnetic anomalies possibly blocked Titanic's messages to other ships. For example, the steamer SS La Providence didn't receive any signals from the sinking ship at all. Yet they were still getting transmissions from another giant, the Olympic, which was 500 miles from the Titanic. That night, the signals were acting strange. They simply got lost somewhere in space, or they were like a jumbled riddle, impossible to solve. The SS Mount Temple did get a message and rushed to Titanic's aid. But as fate would have it, the rescue ship got stuck in ice. She did arrive at Titanic's last known coordinates, but the luxury liner was nowhere to be seen. So were the coordinates accurate at all? The steamer Carpathia was about 60 miles away. At 12:30, their radio operator told the Titanic's crew they were rushing to help. The ship famous for coming to the aid, Carpathia, was going full steam ahead. But here's the odd part. At first, they headed to the wrong spot. The magnetic storm could have thrown its equipment off. Good news is the steamer did end up reaching the right place when they saw the lifeboats full of passengers. Interestingly, once she reached land, the Carpathia didn't have any problems with her equipment. The blackout happened just around the wreckage site. The following investigation blamed radio amateurs for blocking signals. We now might know otherwise. Zinkova explains that at that time, they didn't know exactly how and to what extent the sun influences the Earth. No one could have guessed that the sun could tamper with these massive ships' navigational equipment, especially one that had the best of the best at the time. There's another theory that even the moon could have played a role. Some researchers claim that in January 1912, our natural satellite was closer to the Earth than usual. It caused very strong tides and raised the sea level. Every year, icebergs break away from Greenland and stop around Newfoundland. But not that year. The increased water flow pushed them further for 3 months. And come April, they were right in the way of transatlantic ships. Unfortunately, it was a recipe for disaster when it came to the mighty Titanic. The Kraken is a colossal squid, a legendary sea monster, the biggest hunk of calamari you ever saw. And if this monster had existed, the world would have changed beyond recognition. The Kraken has powerful tentacles, solid muscles with suckers at the end. They're just impossible to escape. The Kraken can break a ship in half or just pull it down into the depths. But the worst thing about the Kraken is its size. According to old sailor stories, the Kraken reached 5,000 feet in length. That's almost 10 soccer fields. Hey, maybe the Kraken could play soccer. The Kraken legend said the monster was so giant that sailors mistook it for a small island. In past centuries, it would have been impossible to defeat such a beast. If the Kraken existed in reality, it might have had offspring. Yeah, in all the world's oceans, there would be giant monsters that could sink any ship. It's unlikely that the Kraken would have competitors in its habitat, so its population would grow strongly. Since the Kraken is enormous, it would need lots of food, so the population of other large sea animals would fall significantly. Blue whales, great white sharks, other giant squids, all the big sea creatures would be endangered. Many people are starving because of the reduction of large fish in the ocean. Urban economies that rely on fishing will be in decline. Prices for small fish around the world are getting more expensive because it's unsafe to fish. To defeat the Kraken, you need powerful weapons, but the monster is tough to catch. The Kraken belongs to the cephalopod genus. This species includes squid and octopus, some of the most intelligent creatures on the planet. The Kraken is a skilled hunter and will never fight in the open. So, what can you do? You can't track the Kraken because it approaches from the depths, not the surface. Though you may be able to tell that the monster is somewhere nearby if a lot of fish surface. When the Kraken swims, it scares all the fish in the vicinity. But it might already be too late. A huge tentacle emerges from the water, resembling a high tower. This tower falls on the deck of the ship, shattering it. The sailors scream and run. The Kraken lands a second blow, and the vessel is almost capsized. Next, the Kraken wraps its giant tentacles around the ship and pulls it to the bottom. Oh boy! What if the sailors managed to detach the ship from the tentacles of this monster? With the help of powerful weapons, the ship's crew strikes back. The Kraken retreats under the water. It's hurt, angry. It seems the battle is over, but here comes the worst. A whirlpool forms beside the ship. Thanks to its considerable weight, when the Kraken dives, it creates a whirlpool behind it. Like a drain in a giant bathtub, this whirlpool sucks the ship down. The battle with the Kraken is lost. Well, that was unfortunate. You might be able to defeat the monster if you can anticipate its attack in advance. But the Kraken can see you and your ship before you can see it. Colossal squids live in deep waters, and they have the largest eyes among all animals. The squid's eye is the size of a dinner plate. Thanks to this, they can see their prey from far away. Similarly, a Kraken would spot the ship much sooner than sonar could pick up the Kraken. It would always have the drop on you. Well, that's not good. Around the world, cargo transportation by ship is declining. Airlines provide the only safe connection between the continents. This will increase air pollution. The most successful enemy of the Kraken is submarines. They travel at great depths and are equipped with powerful echolocators to help detect the Kraken in advance. Subs are well armed too, and the round metal body is not so easy to destroy. A single Kraken may be defeated by a submarine, but what if there are several sea monsters? 3 Kraken can wrap their tentacles around the submarine and drag it deeper into the water where the pressure will destroy their enemy. In other words, they'll have a crush on you. The existence of the Kraken will have dramatically changed the development of many countries. What if Christopher Columbus, on his famous journey, noticed an island that he thought was the New World? He approaches it, but tentacles emerge from the island and sink Columbus's ship. The colonization of North America is delayed, maybe until airplanes are invented, and the first crewed flight wasn't until the 20th century. There would be no Hollywood. There would be no hamburgers, no famous American music playing. There wouldn't be YouTube, which means you wouldn't be watching this video right now. Worst of all, the internet wouldn't exist either. And all this because of one stupid monster squid. The Vikings wouldn't sail on their long ships to raid and settle foreign territories. The history of Norway, Sweden, Finland, and other Nordic countries would have changed drastically. Hey, maybe the Titanic wouldn't have hit an iceberg, but a giant sea monster instead. Though, it's unlikely that people would take trips on huge ocean liners in a world where the Kraken exists. Maybe though, the Kraken isn't all that aggressive. Still, they need a lot of food, and because of the growing population of these monsters, there will be much less food in the ocean. Therefore, the Kraken will increasingly come to the surface for hunting. In the future, the Kraken will migrate closer to the shore. In many countries, people then are not allowed to swim in the ocean. Imagine floating on the waves and a monster the size of a skyscraper is swimming right below you. Relaxing at sea and on the beach will no longer be popular. Many countries that live off tourism become impoverished. When the Krakens grow hungrier, they try to capture prey from land. A huge squid could attack small port cities. Houses, docks, streets, everything can be crushed. A tremendous amount of plastic is thrown into the ocean near the coasts of large countries. billions of tons of plastic will bother the Kraken. An angry, hungry monster can attack bridges like the Golden Gate Bridge. Imagine that a huge squid surrounds the bridge and blocks all traffic. Some of these squids could break the strong cables with their power, and the entire structure would collapse into the water. Ooh! It's good that the Kraken doesn't really exist to swim in our seas and oceans, at least as far as we know. But could the monster have actually existed? Legends stretch back years, but scientific evidence appeared in the middle of the 19th century. In 1857, a 3-inch diameter squid beak was discovered on the coast of Denmark. Other huge squid remains were found in the Bahamas, and then scientists were convinced that gigantic squids existed. While colossal squid has been officially discovered since then, it's been more than 100 years, and we still don't know what max size they can grow to. The fact is, colossal squids are one of the most elusive creatures on Earth. They live in the depths of the ocean where it's challenging for scientists to reach. Any dive to a greater depth requires powerful, bulky equipment. Underwater bath escapes and cameras make a lot of noise and light, which squids notice from afar. They flee before we can see them. The legend of the Kraken probably appeared because of a real colossal squid. People in the past didn't know about these creatures' existence, so when they saw one for the first time, they described it as a massive, terrible monster. It's difficult to say if these huge squids were the size of a small island, because the truth is, we've only studied about 5% of the ocean. It may be that in its depths, monsters much more terrible than the Kraken swim. Like my nephew, Peter.